just to give you an idea, before you can see I can see there's not much left of the church today, and it's in very bad need of repair, and the interior is overgrown. It's been fenced off by the OPW because it's in an unstable condition at present. Now, although it doesn't look like there's much left from the air, the church has some very interesting features. You can see its ornate western doorway here. It has very interesting architrave which protrude from the outer wall, and you can see chevron mouldings on the left and right hand side of these. These are what I describe as a zigzag type of pattern, and also several heads located above the doorway. Now that it's a Romanesque church, 12th century, and that concrete lintel is not 12th century. That's a later addition added during 1915 restorations, and I'll show you images of what they originally would have looked like later on. You can see several of the figures located here. Just try to attempt to explain some of them. The figure on the left is quite a grotesque looking figure. I'm not 100% sure what he's supposed to be. Second from the left is possibly an abbot or a holy person. You can see the tonsure on top of his head. A third in from the left is a bishop with his mitred hat. And fourth in from the left we have a bearded figure, possibly of benefactory to the church. And the last two figures there on the right hand side are very badly worn and unfortunately can't be discerned today. Now also surrounding the church within the graveyard there are several interesting archaeological features. These include cross slabs containing a Maltese design. You can see the one here on the left and the right hand side. Unfortunately the one on the right hand side we don't know its current location. And we can see another image of a Maltese cross also on the left-hand side. And the feature on the right-hand side is a sundial. It's often synonymous with clone. You can see in the upper part, in the middle perforation, how lines radiate from this centrally out towards the edge, and that the idea is that there would have been probably some sort of a metal rod protruding from this and would have cast the shadows of the sun and used to tell the different times of the day. These two features have been recently moved from Clone Church and are currently in Tintern Abbey for safekeeping. When we undertook the survey with the grants, we were able to employ the help of John Tierney of historicgraves.ie. And John came to us and he trained us up in how to undertake transcribing and recording of the headstones. Some of them were illegible, very hard to read, but using various techniques we were able to do so. And we undertook this survey as part of a Heritage Week event, and we invited local people from the community to come out and learn a bit more about the local heritage, and we were very pleased with the outcome of the entire project. So this was done in a systematic format, and there had been previous surveys done before, but to make sure that we didn't miss anyone buried beneath the ground, we started over again. What we did was we were broken into teams. The initial team went around and marked each individual grave, numbered them, followed by a photograph was taken of each graveyard, and then several teams followed behind recording the details, including the dimensions, any iconography, and the names and details of the transcriptions. Now there's various methods used to read the headstones. Number one was a rubbing, so paper was placed over the headstones, and then using carbon paper wrapped around a sponge, we rubbed it. And the idea is the carbon paper catches any indentations in it, letterings, iconography, and you can see here it shows up very well. You can see the top part of the stone, granite stone, very badly worn, couldn't even make it out with lights or anything else, and this showed it up perfectly. You can see the IHS common feature of graves and headstones, and the cross coming straight up from the H. Now, this wasn't just an exercise in collecting data and uploading it online. We're trying to essentially look at the stories behind the headstones. What can we find out socially about the people? Archaeology is looking at the material culture of people to try and find out about the past, and headstones can form part of that material culture. And you see here a clone. Although this is an ongoing process, still some things I can say here today is that Clone is a shared graveyard between both Catholics and Protestants, despite an often rival history between both, and with the Reformation and such. The oldest headstone dates from 1777. Quite a few date from 1798. They may correlate with the rebellion at the time. And there's also an oral history collected of burials being found to the south of the church during ploughing. And also I was talking to a local man by the name of Alan Owens recently, who informed me that there was a cholera outbreak, and he back probably, and there's no date, probably well back in the 18 or 1700s, and there's supposedly a mass grave to the rear of the church. So again, we're collecting all these stories and trying to amalgamate them into a single source. And also we have an example. Majority of the graves actually within the site are unmarked headstones. So these are poor people from a lesser well-off background. And then we have examples of people from a more well-off background, such as the Rudd family. So it wasn't just shared by both Catholics and Protestants, but also by rich and by poor. Now, to go forward to Clone has a monastic origin. It's often stated by several scholars that Clone dates back, even though it's 12th century church, it dates back to a monastic origin associated with St Aidan. Graf von Flood in 1916 says that Clone was one of the oldest foundations in the Diocese of Ferns and is rightly attributed to St Aidan. Reverend Cosgrave speaks of how it's frequently stated that it goes back to St Aidan. And in Hoare interestingly refers to the Abbey of Clone and how it was the most ancient church in the district, and it was probably founded at the time during St Aidan's rule. And more recently, as part of many of you might have seen up in Newgrange, they discovered a henge during the dry weather. I suppose I should explain how these features form. Essentially, if you have a dug feature such as a ditch, and that's backfilled, that holds moisture better than the surrounding natural subsoil. And when the crops are turning ripe from green, those that grow above this feature tend to hold their colour for a little bit longer. And I'll speak about that in a moment. Sorry, my slides got mixed up here now. But there was excavations undertaken within the vicinity of Clone. You can see the area marked here on the right-hand side. This donates a field that was, from which in 2006 there was planning permission applied for, and as a condition that planning permission, test trenching had to be undertaken, and during which they found several features containing charcoal and slag, and these were interpreted as evidence of industrial activity, possibly connected with the monastery or medieval church at Clone. Now, metalworking is a craft that's often associated with monastic sites. So again, this possibly gives further credit to a monastic origin for the 12th century, prior to the 20th century church. Now, what essentially does this mean or tell us about the church at Clone? Well, such features are often associated with early monastic sites to delimit the sacred interiors of the church. And we know from archaeological excavations that a majority of these have been dated to the 6th and 8th century. And we know from documentary evidence that no new saints are attributed to new church foundations after the 8th century. So if you combine the Bull-on stones, the association with St Aidan, along with this discovery, I would advocate strongly for an early ecclesiastical origin to the church at Clone. Plus possibly one which may have been associated here with St Aidan himself. In terms of what it would have functioned as, I cannot say, but I know that often the size of these enclosures tells a lot of their status. And during recent geophysical investigations here to the rear of this church in the Abbey Field, they uncovered evidence of a large monastic enclosure, much larger than that at Clone. So we can say that Clone, during the time of what's contemporary with the monastery here at Ferns, would have functioned with a lesser status. Now, what can excavations tell us about St Aidan and his monastery? Now, unfortunately, there exists no definite evidence from archaeological excavations or material taken from the ground associated with the monastery, and this is very unusual considering the high status and the importance that we've learned today that had often held. This is not to say, though, that nothing remains. It's just possibly that the trenches haven't been dug in the right location. But what we do have is other investigations have turned up a little bit more. So I think it was in 2015, 2016, there was geophysical investigations undertaken in the field behind me, and you can see the diagram here, which is courtesy of Ger Dowling. They uncovered multiple linear features, and just notice St Mary's Abbey there. You can see the two concentric lines, one here and another here, which were thought to form part of a monastic enclosure, like that one that I spoke of in Clone. Again, its size would suggest that Ferns was quite an important site, and also notice how it goes underneath the abbey. And it has been suggested, like Tycho O'Keefe said earlier, that the monastics may have simply moved from the original monastery to the abbey, that perhaps the building of the abbey over the inner enclosure, which would have been the most important, was a way of kind of officially closing one chapter, moving from one church into another during the Reform. So just a couple of concluding remarks. Although the medieval Clone Church is a ruin, it experiences continuity within the community through the Clone Church Conservation Project, which we hope to continue into the future. Ferns archaeological records suggest that it may have been a place of significance before Christianity, which in turn perhaps influenced St Aidan's decision to establish the monastery here in the first place. And although excavations have failed to encounter any links with St Aidan's monasteries, stray finds and the discovery of a large enclosure suggest it was quite an important site. And the presence of a multi-valid ring fort further strengthens the fact that Ferns was a place of royal significance during the early medieval period. I'd just like to finish with a quote from the late Father Ransom, which I think is very suitable for the end of this conference. Although this is directed towards the restorations of Clone Church, I think it can go towards the general knowledge we've learned here today. Here we have attempted to restore something that was lost sight of and buried for ages. We are not indifferent to the men who have gone before us, nor to the monuments they have left behind them. We are the growth of past generations. From them we have our life, which is left of what is left of our language, our civilization, our culture, and our religion. And I'd like to thanks very much for that.